Good morning, everybody. I hope you're having a good day today, and I'd like to welcome you to this webinar that we're holding in conjunction with Sonatype. My name is Chris Bland. I'm the CEO of BDQ, and joining us today are Dominic Bush, or Dom Bush, who's the CTO of BDQ, and Ilkka Turunen, who is the Global Director of Pre-Sales Engineering and Solutions Architecture at Sonatype. We've all got backgrounds in cloud computing, software, with particular specializations in DevOps. And today we are going to cover a topic that is foremost in everybody's mind, the new GDPR regulations coming down from the EU. And with that in mind, I will hand over to my colleague, Dom Bush, who is going to talk through GDPR and what it's going to mean to us all.
Thanks, Chris.
Hi, Dom.
Thanks, Chris. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. So the agenda really for the call is what we have on the screen here. We're going to do an overview of what is GDPR, and then we're going to look at what we think are some pragmatic solutions to some of the problems that are thrown up by the legislation. Then we're going to hand over to Ilkka to talk about Sonatype's products and how we can take GDPR into account in our DevOps pipeline using the Nexus series of products. And then we're going to go into a Q&A at the end. So let's start at the beginning. What is GDPR? But first of all, it'd be really useful if I could just throw up a quick poll just to understand some of your backgrounds. And can you see potentially a poll?
Yeah, Dom, the poll showing up.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So basically, I was just wondering if we could just leave that up for a couple of minutes, and if you were able to just rate your understanding of GDPR at the moment, from beginner through to expert, and we could just sort of see where we need to pitch this particular part of the presentation. So I was seeing some results coming in now. So let's close that poll and then share the results of it. You should be able to see on the screen there the results of the poll. So I can see that sort of 25% of you rate your knowledge as sort of beginner kind of level, and 63% are sort of mid-tier, middle of the road.
And 13% are a bit higher than that.
The rest of the presentation should be able to address both types of audience. The other thing that will be interesting, just to get a bit of a background from yourselves, is how advanced your current GDPR implementations are. So again, if I just throw up another poll, you should see that on the screen there. Again, it would be just really useful to understand where you are on the path to GDPR compliance. Again, just seeing a few answers coming in at the minute. Okay, that's great. So if I close that poll and share the result, you should see there, basically 17% of you have said that you're not currently started. 50% you're in the initial planning phase, and 33% your implementation has started but not yet completed, and no one's in the happy position of completing their GDPR project yet. So hopefully the information in the rest of the presentation should help you move further along those particular phases of your GDPR implementation. So let's start off. What is GDPR? So we're going to answer the question about what GDPR is by breaking it into 4 different topics. So a brief overview, and it will, by the nature of the particular time that we have available today, will have to be a brief overview to the legislation. I mean, it's made up of 173 recitals, 93 articles split across 11 chapters running to 88 pages. So it is quite a complicated piece of documentation to review and get on top of. But we're just going to do a brief overview of what are some of the big picture topics are. And hopefully that should put the context for the rest of the presentation that's going to follow on from there. We're also going to look at what we think are some of the key data protection principles. What are the things that we need to take into account as we move forward with our implementation? So which are the articles that we think are potentially ones that are crucial to the rest of the implementation of the process? We're also going to look at what are the key changes from previous legislation We're also going to be looking, as part of that section, what are some of the new penalties that are associated with the legislation. And then finally, we're going to look at what the deadline is. So let's jump right into it. So the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, is really an update to early European data protection directives. And they were put in place back in 95, was when the initial one was published, to really enshrine into legislation the human right of privacy regarding the way that personal data or personal information about individuals is collected and handled by organisations. And in the UK, this directive was implemented in the Data Protection Act of 1998. Now, obviously 1995 and 98 were certainly very different technologically from the current technological landscape. On this slide here, obviously that's what the web used to look like back in 95, 98. And on the right, that's what mobile phones used to look like, the old Nokia 5110. Back then, only 1% of Europeans were using the internet. Frankly, a statistic which seems inconceivable today with the rise of e-commerce, cloud storage, social media and so on. As these digital opportunities have come to the fore, we obviously have to take into account how we handle that data. And the legislation really is trying to address the need to strengthen the safeguards of how data is used by organisations in order to make sure that our right to privacy remains. So, one of the questions that often comes up is, what is the implication of Brexit? The reality is the UK's Information Commissioner Office, which is the organisation that regulates this particular area of legislation, was actually one of the driving forces behind this change to EU legislation. No matter the outcome of Brexit, basically the UK will be implementing the changes associated with the legislation as part of a new Data Protection Act, which is currently through the initial stages of being passed. What that will do will be directly implement GDPR into our domestic UK law, thereby bringing EU law into force. And the main objectives of this new Data Protection Act really is to maintain public trust in how personal data is handled, ensure uninterrupted data flows between the UK and the EU globally for future purposes, and to maintain the ability to share, receive and protect data for security and law enforcement purposes following Brexit. Okay. So what are some of the key data protection principles that we think the legislation throws up? Well, the first one is Article 5, and that describes the principles relating to the processing of personal data. And this really is a tightening up of some of the principles that were enshrined in the previous Data Protection Act. And it sets out 6 key principles for how personal data should be treated and handled by organisations. And I've just put up 3 there for you to read. I won't read them now in the interest of time. But looking across there, the other part of Article 5, Part 2, requires that the controller should be responsible for and able to demonstrate compliance with the principles. And this is one of the things that we think is quite challenging about the GDPR. It's actually being able to, if ICO comes a knocking, how do we demonstrate that we've enshrined these particular principles into our development process and how we treat data within our organisations? The other 2 articles from the legislation that we think are crucial is Article 25 and Article 32. So Article 25 talks about data protection by design and default. With our partners at Sonatype, we believe that one of the critical parts of ensuring the security of people's personal data is ensuring that we get information to the hands of developers about the quality of the open source software components they use early into the software development lifecycle, or SDLC as that's shown there. And we need to try and make sure that we put data privacy really into the core of what we do when we're developing software and not attempt to bolt it on later on in the development cycle. Turning to Article 32, that really talks about the security of processing. So we have a responsibility to ensure the security of processing. And again, Sonatype's products allow for continuous monitoring for new vulnerabilities and action taken based on the policies that we set up and put in place It also allows accurate and up-to-date information allows us to respond to vulnerabilities as they're announced, and therefore mitigating any exposures that we might have to data loss. So let's now just very quickly go through the various different key changes that the legislation introduces compared to what we've had previously. So the first one is the increased territorial scope, and this is possibly one of the biggest changes. So previous legislation was on a national level. There were the principles outlined by the various different directives, but they were then enshrined in the local member states law, which really resulted in a slightly patchwork approach when it comes to the legislation across the union. This will level the playing field, and the legislation will be the same across all the member states. But the additional part of this is that the legislation will affect any organisation worldwide that handles data about any EU citizens. So it is a worldwide thing. If you're a US company but you're dealing with information about customers in the UK, for example, you will be covered by GDPR. The other part of it is that it's not just client data, it's also user data or employee data or contracts even. It's any personal information that we hold about identifiable individuals. So let's move on to penalties. This is another one of the big changes. Under the GDPR, fines for non-compliance are intended to be, quote, effective and dissuasive. And the first one for slightly less serious contraventions of the legislation, potentially it's the greater of 2% of gross annual turnover or 10 million euro. For more serious contraventions, 4% or 20 million euro. So that obviously those are quite financially significant fines there. And this, to compare it with what we currently have, the UK's Information Commission Office can currently only levy fines up to £500,000. So if we look at some of the historical fines that they've levied against some people that have contravened the regulations, TalkTalk were fined £400,000 in 2016. Under the new legislation, that will be £59 million. Another example for a slightly smaller company, Pharmacy to You, they were fined £130,000 in 2015, and that will become £4.4 million. So someone's done an analysis of the fines that ICO have levied historically, and comparing to what will be the case under the new legislation, they said that potentially the fines will be 79 times higher than under GDPR. So certainly from a financial point of view, it's certainly important to comply with the legislation. But there are other reasons to comply with the legislation. And the first one basically is an example here from Equifax. And I think, Ilkka, you were going to talk us through this slide.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much for having me here today, Chris. And this Equifax case is something that we here at Sonatype have been kind of looking at with a very keen eye, both because it affects us here in Europe in ways that we couldn't quite see, and also because it's a very sad type example of what is essentially now the largest data breach in history. So for those of you who are dialing the call and might not know exactly what Equifax is, it's one of the credit information processing companies based out of the US. So they manage credit information, credit scores, etc., and they do operate under a wide label brand here in the UK as well. Equifax had a security breach. So, sorry, I guess, Dom, if you can just click ahead with this, please. Here we go. Essentially, the story of Equifax is unfortunately quite a sad one. Equifax had a security breach very late this summer, July of this year. Essentially, they lost about 145 million pieces of personally identifiable information. And as time went on, we could trace this security vulnerability actually back to a security vulnerability that was discovered in one of the components in the Apache Struts framework, which is a very popular online web framework to build your websites on. The vulnerability was discovered on March the 7th, and if we can click forward on the slide, please. It actually actually took all the way up to July 29 for Equifax to discover that they had been breached. So on July 29, they get the call. They realized that some unauthorized access has been happened, and they realized that the root cause of this was a vulnerability that occurred on March the 7th. Can you click forward, please? When time went by, we started realizing that actually the large-scale exploitation of the downloading of those personally identifiable pieces of data had already started in the beginning of May. And if we click forward, even more so, as the investigations further progressed, they realized that actually the very first unauthorized access using this non-vulnerable open source component actually already occurred 2 days after the discovery of the initial vulnerability. So if we click forward. So actually what probably happened was Equifax was probed early March, April time, and then the attackers found a way and started downloading that data. Why this is significant is because they lost the personal information, credit card information, home addresses, and even social security numbers for the Americans, which is pretty big, for about 145 million consumers. I think it's actually 147 now, and about 650,000 of those were here in the UK as well. The worst thing is most customers didn't know that they were customers of Equifax. If we move on. And what's pretty interesting about this is they only really had 2 days to apply these patches. And if we move on, they actually only really came out with the vulnerability to the public in September. In a GDPR context, this is a story that unfortunately isn't a very good one because GDPR now mandates that you have about 72 hours of notifying your customers that that you have a data breach that has been affected. So based on the numbers that Dom mentioned previously, under GDPR, so if this would have happened a few months later, the potential fine for their business would have instantly been about 45 to 46 million pounds under the 4% global turnover rule. They did suffer a lot of losses. Their CTO, CEO, and CIO all took early retirement and are currently under investigation. So these are not minor numbers, unfortunately, and so even a small thing such as leaving a REST API plugin in your website unpatched can lead to some pretty intense consequences. So quite an important topic to be discussing.
Thanks, Ilkka. So basically, yep, there are other reasons, reputational on top of the financial, which really we need to address and make sure that we're protected there. Just returning to the key changes, one of the key ones is consent. The conditions associated with our data subjects consenting for us to use their personal information have been strengthened. We need to make sure that the request for consent is given in a way that's intelligible and easily accessible. So no jargon, no legalese. It's got to be clear and concise, and we've got to tell the data subject the purpose for the data processing, so they can make a reasoned decision about whether they want to consent for us to use their data. We've also got to make sure that our consent notices are all actively opt-in, so no more checked options which sign people up to mailing lists without them actively having to click a box. So it's got to be a clear consent message, intelligible, easy to understand, plain and clear language, and it must be easy for our data subjects to withdraw their consent as well as give it. The other major part of the legislation that we need to take into account is that the data subject rights have been beefed up, if you will. So under previous legislation, data subjects can make various requests of data controllers. These have been tightened up, so people could ask the right to be informed, are you using my data, the right for access, the right to rectification. If I identify an error in the data that you're holding about me, I have the right to ask you to amend that. The right to erase, also called the right to be forgotten. I want you to delete all my data. The right to restrict processing. I can ask the data controller to stop processing my data while we resolve an issue. The right to data portability. That is a new one that's been introduced, where I can ask a data controller to give me the data that's associated with me so I can pass it over potentially to another provider. The right to object. I can object to perhaps an automated decision-making process. and rights in relation to automated decision making and profiling. So these particular rights, under previous legislation, we could charge data subjects in order to respond to them. So we could charge them £10, I think was the figure. Under the new legislation, we've got to be able to handle them for free under most circumstances. And also, under the legislation, we have to respond in a timely fashion. So it's a reduction in time from 40 days to within a month. And there are penalties associated with not responding in a timely fashion to these requests. So it's really important that we put in place processes to manage these requests. It's somewhat uncertain how many additional requests will be generated by the legislation. One piece of research was by the media agency, the 7 Stars, when they polled some UK residents. The vast majority of them had never heard of GDPR, but when they were informed of the rights that they had under the legislation, 34% of British people said that they would exercise their right to be forgotten, the right to erase. So potentially we would say to the data controller, we want that data deleted. So that it's uncertain, but there may be an upswing in the number of these requests that we have to handle. The other part of data subject rights that we have to consider are about data breaches. As Ilkka was saying, we've got 72 hours in order to respond once we become aware of a data breach or data loss. We have to respond to that and inform the appropriate supervisory regulatory body in the UK. That will be ICO. So we've really got to make sure that we have the procedures in place prior to an incident. We need to have that documented, ready to go. And with any emergency process, we must test it, refine it, and practice it to make sure that we can deploy it in the case of an actual data breach or indeed data loss. The other part, privacy by design. So this is Article 25, which we highlighted earlier. This has always been recommended best practice, and in fact, the UK's ICO have really championed this idea of privacy by design and privacy information assessments. But for the first time, it's actually going to be written into the legislation that we have to take into account good practice. We need to put the rights of data subjects at the core of our development efforts using best practice such as pseudonymization, data minimization, personal information audits, and so on. And the other part of the key changes is that GDPR makes it a requirement that organizations appoint a data protection officer in some circumstances. It depends on the size of the company and the nature of the business that you do. So for instance, if you're a public authority, you have to have one. If you're involved in large-scale monitoring of individuals, online behavior tracking, for instance, that might be something else that requires you to have a DPO. And a DPO is an individual who's responsibilities are outlined in Article 39 there. So they're going to act as the advisor within the organisation to inform employees about their obligations under the law. They should also monitor compliance with GDPR and other data protection laws. And they're going to be the first point of contact for the supervisory authorities in the case that some sort of breach may have occurred. So let's look at the deadline for these changes. Okay, this is the timeline for the legislation. It started all the way back in January 2012. And here we are now in 2018, and we're just about there. So not too much longer to go. In fact, it's 71 days and approximately 12 hours remaining, or 49.5 UK workdays remaining before the legislation comes into force. So what do we think are the main steps to becoming compliant? Well, these are the things that we should consider in order to move our GDPR implementation forward. These are the difficult problems that we've been mentioning in the title of the webinar. So the next section of the presentation is really to look at how we go about using some of the lessons products potentially to help us with pragmatic solutions to these problems. So here are the list of things. Obviously, we can probably break these down into 3 different categories of activities that we need to consider: documentation, development, and process. And if we map down these different tasks into their various different things, basically we've got a certain amount of documentation that we need to handle. Looking at the top there, and down the bottom we have these data subject requests and data breach notifications where we've got to put in place a process to handle them. And then for privacy by design, really there's an element of documentation and development. And for data minimization and pseudonymization, again, documentation that we need to hold and development that we've got to carry out. So I'm going to look really at documentation and process using Confluence and JIRA Service Desk. And Ilkka's going to come back and look at development and how Sonatype's products will help with those kind of issues. So first of all, let's just have a quick look at Atlassian Confluence. So the Atlassian Confluence product is their enterprise wiki, which allows organizations to allow their staff members to collaborate together on documents and share them throughout the organization. So there are custom spaces for teams, projects and departments with unique permissions and themes. So it is a way of sharing information, but also making sure that we have the appropriate safeguards in place. So if I just step out of the presentation and move over to here, what I have on the screen, hopefully you can see it, is just in our development environment, basically I've copied over some of the information that we have within our own space that we use to manage our own GDPR implementation. Obviously I can't show you the precise details that we have in there for GDPR data privacy reasons, but hopefully this will give you a flavour of some of the things that you can do with Confluence in order to support your GDPR efforts. So one of the things that we found very useful actually was just to import into the tool the GDPR legislation. So for instance, if we go through here, basically we can see the documentation associated with it. And within Confluence we can make basic notations on what we see within the tool. So I can put comments here. In line, or alternatively I can mention other staff members. And Chris will get a notification saying that he needs to look at this. So it's just a good way to bring together a documentation into one place where we can collaborate over it. And each of the pages has a link that we can show around the organization and also a change history, so we can see if we amend the text, what people have changed. The other aspects that we found useful really is obviously our responsibilities under GDPR. We have to deal with things like contractual information. So for instance here we've got the log me in incorporated terms of service and our agreement with them. It's useful for reviewing here to make sure that they have the clauses required in order to meet GDPR's requirements. And again, we can document our various different concerns and issues and questions that we want to add against these particular pieces of documentation and share them with our colleagues. The other thing that we found useful is we have a requirement under Article 30, I think it is, basically to record the various different processing activities that we do. So for instance here what we've got is a description of one of the processing activities that we do with GoToWebinar. Basically we can record the information that ICO requires us to have and also again collaborate over it, and then we can store that in a place that is shared across everybody, which is searchable, that we can find this information, we can keep it up to date and track changes. So that really is a very quick run through some of the things that Confluence can do. One of the advantages of Confluence is that obviously we can export the contents of this and hand it to ICO in the case that they require us to present this information. It's a living document which reflects the current state of affairs, and we could see that there. Okay, just in the interest of time I'll have to move on to this second topic. So the other part of it is Atlassian JIRA Service Desk. It is Atlassian's service desk product. It has a customer self-service portal and SLAs to track response times. So this is a way that we can help manage the data subject requests and data breach notifications and make sure that we're going to meet the deadlines as described under the documentation. So let's just go over and have a quick look here. What I've got on screen here is the JIRA Service Desk web portal where users can come in and make various different requests associated with it. So for instance here, if I was wanting to make a request on behalf of a user, basically I could say Mr. Smith and basically add in the various different details associated with it. I could drag in basically the proof of identity associated with that, and we can make this available to our end customers, and we can set up the various different questions that they want resolving basically as part of their data subject request. So some of the fields that I need to fill in.
You're showing us the validation features there, Don?
No, yes, that's exactly it. Absolutely. Right. There we go. So that is basically an example of a data subject request that we put in. On the other side of the coin, we can see here in the what's called the agent view, we can see that particular request has just dropped in. This is the way that agents who are handling these particular data subject requests can see the requests as they come in. We can see from this view here the information associated with it. There is a workflow that sits beneath this, which the particular data subject request will go through on its way to being resolved. So we verify, identify, we review the request, we possibly refer back to the initial customer, and we create our response and close off this particular request. We can also see the documentation that they provided along with their request. One of the key features of the product is the tracking of the time to resolution. So we can see here basically how long we've got left before this particular subject request is going to be in breach of the requirements within under GDPR. So it really is a way of tracking and managing these potentially quite time-consuming requests that come in and making sure that we comply with the various different requirements under the legislation. So again, another just very brief run through of what we think are pragmatic solutions to these particular problems. So at that point, I will hand over to Ilkka.
Wonderful. So, I really like the introduction of the kind of enterprise workflow on how to deal with the data compliancy side of things and the requests. And I think the workflows everybody pretty much has to work out, and that's really what's quite complex about the GDPR compliance to me, is that there's so many aspects of it. We here at Sonatype, we focus on the software delivery side of things. So as a company, we work predominantly with software development environments. We've actually come from the background of being founded by the two inventors of Maven, which is one of the most used build tools in the Java ecosystem. So over the last 10 years or so, we've really focused quite heavily on helping our customers deal with security vulnerabilities and governance issues resulting from using third-party open source components. We are custodians of one of the largest libraries of open source in the Java ecosystem, a service called Maven Central, which today holds about over 2 million unique Java artifacts and had almost 90 billion, that's with 9 zeros, downloads of Java artifacts in the world. And over the last 10 years, we've noticed that we've observed that within software development, the landscape has changed significantly. today, when we think about enterprise software, we have to come to grips with the fact that actually most modern applications are not written by your own software developers anymore. In fact, over the last decade or so, the field has transformed so that actually 80 to 90% of most applications are actually completely pre-assembled using third-party or open source prefabricated components, such as dependencies, frameworks, libraries, modules, etc. So when it comes down to the security field of GDPR, actually quite a lot of effort we see with our customers going into securing the code that you produce yourself, but unfortunately there is not a lot of effort going into actually securing the code that you consume. Unfortunately, nowadays it tends to be the third-party code that is the largest attack vector that we see, as unfortunately evidenced by the Equifax case, where a submodule of the Apache Struts framework was really the cause and culprit for the actual eventual large data breach. So it could be tracked over to a fairly simple vulnerability, in fact. So how can we deal with this, and how can we make our software development environment compliant? So as we remember, one of the articles said that we have to be thinking about software delivery and creating security by design as opposed to creating security as an afterthought. So when we look at our customer software delivery environments at an abstract level, without looking into dependency management or looking into requirements management as Tom did, we observe these modules: source control management, build environments, artifact repositories, and some sort of deployment automation. And typically the way their software publication process goes is developers get some source code, they also download some third-party components, and they may have a local artifact repository from where they get those, or they might use external third-party repositories such as Maven Central or npm.js or the Docker Hub to do that. Well, as they develop their processes, this triggers automatic builds in their CI services like Jenkins or Bamboo, and of course those consume the same dependencies as well. Outcomes are deployable, and that ultimately gets deployed into whatever target environment that we are wanting to deploy into. So typically when this is the starting place, and when security by default comes into question, the most common activity most companies tend to say is, let's implement stricter security controls within our penetration testing regime. So if you are already doing those sorts of things, typically very much towards the end of the delivery process, companies will perform some sort of security audits or security testing with their applications that are about to be promoted into production. Unfortunately, when we're talking about designing security into the process itself, this often is very much too late in the life cycle. Findings can, typically at this point, there's not much time or budget left in the project. So typically what happens is the findings from the penetration test are pretty much processed as fast as we can, and a lot of risk is left on the table to be processed later in later releases. And unfortunately, that's how the rabbit wheel goes, from one project to another. So we believe that actually, in order to augment this, you have to introduce testing into this mix. That's what our Nexus IQ server does. It introduces the ability for you to create on a per application basis rules about your open source components that you can actually run all the way from day 1 to day 100 of your development cycle. It actually starts all the way from developers. You need to be able to give your developers early feedback about the known security vulnerabilities that they have within the third-party components that they're downloading from these external libraries. This way, they can mitigate issues on day 1 instead of during the penetration test. Of course, introducing this automation during the ingestion phase allows you to make automated decisions whether or not we even want any components in, or whether or not we want to block the worst, the ones with the most known and documented critical security vulnerabilities from even entering. Of course, a very powerful place to introduce these sorts of controls and automated testing about these factoids is during the CI process. So actually, we have out-of-the-box plugins both for Atlassian tools and other other popular CI/CD services like Jenkins, where we can actually enforce these policies during build time and even fail the builds and the release process if it is necessary to ensure that we are not publishing anything with known or critical security vulnerabilities. That way, everything that you're building and everything that you're downloading from the external world is becoming trusted by default because it's already gone through several automation gates on its way to our deployment. But what's really cool about this system as well is another issue of GDPR is, of course, that you need to have in place systems to monitor and be able to proactively patch any new known security vulnerabilities that might appear in your application when they're running in production. We provide this capability with our Nexus Lifecycle tool that allows you to also monitor your applications once they do hit into production. Even if they have a green scorecard today, they might not be that in tomorrow or in 2 years' time. So to quickly walk you through how this all kind of falls together, I always like to start my demo here in the development environment, because really this is where decisions are made, and this is probably the most impactful place you can make influence decisions. So what we have is a plugin that actually shows me as a developer all the third-party components and the risk associated with those components that I'm pulling into my project. So I can already see at a glance that they've been traffic light ranked with red being the worst and blue being good. So already I can visually see that even before I do my first commit or my first build, I need to resolve these issues one way or the other, because I know that my company is telling me that this won't go into production because it is not compliant with our risk portfolio or policy. Now I can see many pieces of information about these components, but what's really cool about this is I can actually drill down and see what rules or policies have been broken. So in this case, my security team has set me a policy that says any known security vulnerabilities with a high enough severity have to be dealt with. And I can even see what the vulnerability itself is over here. I can actually see that this component and this version has a arbitrary remote code execution vulnerability. So what I can actually do is I can use this to try and identify better versions. You know, if I, for example, find a version that doesn't have a red triangle, this newer one here, red triangles illustrate security vulnerabilities, I can actually look at this, see that actually this doesn't have any known detailed security vulnerabilities. It looks very much better in the policy view as well. So perhaps I can just migrate over into this later version and go ahead with it. So it's very important that you set aside these policies, and actually the risk portfolio doesn't mean that all of your applications need to be clamped down like Fort Knox or the Bank of England. Instead, what you need to really be doing is finding appropriate security policies for your applications. So the way we deal with this in our tool is we allow you to define policies in an inheritance model, where you can actually set them either on a company-wide basis for more for your critical security policies that must absolutely always apply across your different ecosystems. But you can also create sub-organizations or team-specific rules or use case-specific rules. For example, an internal development tool probably doesn't really need to go through that many security notices, but something that's getting into production or being distributed out and has a high chance of having public exposure, you probably want to make sure goes through a strict security regimen. So through this inheritance model, we can actually come up with a specific set of rules for each application. And so when we're developing those applications, we can actually apply those rules, for example, during a build process. The way this works is fairly simple. What we can do is inject these checks during pretty much any sort of build process. So here I am showing continuous integration, but this could be your local build environment. You could even run a local command line interface just to audit some of your previously built artifacts. And the way this all works is it waits until the actual application is built and actually identifies every single third-party component that gets put into that particular application and into that particular bundle. We then take those fingerprints of those components and fetch the latest security and licensing data about them, and then apply the policies that we previously defined on that application to come up with outputs that you can actually control to say that actually we are failing this build because some of these components that you're using in this particular project still have security vulnerabilities. So if your developers are like how I used to be as a developer, even in here, if you do see some alerts, if it doesn't break your build, it really doesn't mean anything because, hey, it still compiles. So this allows you to kind of draw a line in the sand and ensure that necessary security activities are completed before we even move ahead, kind of helping you prove the case that you're doing security by default. Now, what's really cool about this is once we have run this scan, we can actually get reports for each of our builds that tell us exactly how many components we identify in this particular application, how many of them have known security vulnerabilities. If I wish to, I can actually delve deeper into the security vulnerabilities as well. So as a developer, I can actually go in here, kind of fetch more information about this vulnerability and actually try and figure out the detection guidelining that we give them, if it actually affects them. And of course, through the recommendations, figure out how I can go about fixing this, if there is just a simple upgrade path or if I need to go and deal with this at a higher level. Now, what's really cool about this as well is not only does this give me this readout during the scan or the build that I'm doing, but as I mentioned earlier, we can also perform continuous monitoring that allows you to react to these situations and kind of fulfill that 72-hour time requirement and security by design type of activities. And towards that extent, we can actually take these notices and push them out, for example, to a JIRA instance, where we can actually configure this to talk to any of your projects that you might have configured within your JIRA environment and open up any new tickets of any new security vulnerabilities that might be discovered, let's say 2 or 3 months down the line. So what's really cool about this is it actually opens up a ticket, tells you what the application is, where it was in the software delivery pipeline, if it's early or late. So this was actually in a development environment. We can see the scan results here, and we can always access the detailed report in our IQ server if we want to. And of course, this makes sure that once new security vulnerabilities do happen, it's no longer a exercise of figuring out where do we have this bad component, but rather just taking the ticket, selecting it for development, and moving it through your normal technical debt processes. So this way we can ensure that our software delivery environment is safe and secure. And of course, you know, one of the added benefits of doing activities like this is we can actually then use the scan results and generate to you, for example, risk fields about which components that we have across our applications are the riskiest. So if we're trying to proactively mitigate new risk happening, where do we go and how do we square that away? For example, I can even click here and see this bad component, which applications actually have it, when did we last see it, what was the outcome of that discovery. For example, here we actually failed the release because of that component being present there. And of course, you know, trying to become secure by default, another question you might ask is, where do we start? You know, let's say we have 1,000 applications or 150 as I have in this particular demo server. And where do I start in order to be able to kind of square off the largest risks and make sure that we are making tracks towards compliancy? So I can see here bit of a wall of shame of the components, and of course I can jump into any of these old scan results to investigate further and figure out where we're at. So that's about it for my piece of the demonstration. So introducing these sort of compliances is very easy. Our Nexus IQ server provides all of this capability and helps you, for example, then introduce other sort of alerting mechanisms through the kind of results of these scans pretty much at every single stage of your software delivery pipeline. All right, let me change the presenter back to you, Dom.
Thanks.
There you go.
Thanks, Ilkka. Cheers for that. Let me just... Hopefully that should be back to my screen. Hopefully this presentation has given you a good overview of what the legislation is and how potentially the Atlassian and Sonatype products can help address some of the various different articles within the legislation and some of the requirements associated with that.